the Ag Water Management Board. Now you've seen our recording message. Thanks everyone for coming together in the midst of field season. Hope you've enjoyed the rain the last weekend or so. We have a packed agenda today. This was sent out to you last Friday, and to members of the public, it is available on our Ag Water Management Board website. And I can drop that, or maybe Mark can drop that link into our chat function here. What's on the docket for this meeting today really is to allow the board to start pulling together and thinking about priorities and action items and where we might want to be going strategy-wise, having used the first two meetings to gather information, talk through some questions, etc. So this will be hopefully a conversation-heavy meeting amongst the board members. And in order to get that underway, first we will approve the April 26, 2021 meeting minutes. Could I receive a motion for that approval?
So moved. I'll second it.
Any discussion? Any changes, edits, mistakes? Nope. All right. I will, unless there are any hands raised to make an objection, we will approve these meeting minutes. Okay, thank you. And also, before we get started, wanted to elect the board chair of this board. As you saw from my email to you last week, Darren Hammond has agreed to be nominated for this. I would entertain any other motions or nominees. I did not receive any via email, but can see that. Or if someone would like to move to nominate Darren and have a second, we'll have a vote.
I'd move to nominate Darren Hammond as board chair.
I'd second it.
Terrific. All those in favor? I know I'm deviating from what I just did. Can I see a thumbs up or a yes from meeting?
Yeah.
Thumbs up. All right, I saw Rick nodding. I know a bunch of folks.
We're good.
We're good? Okay. Congratulations, Chairman. Take it away.
Oh, great, thanks.
No, I know that myself, Mark, Bill are here to help move the conversation today. And really, you see that numbers 4, 5, and 6, we proffered these up as discussion items. We certainly don't have to stay wedded to this agenda. We can see where the conversation takes us. For members of the public who are listening, what we have teed up are first talking about what our existing or future needs for any additional irrigation resources. So still, is there more information that we need to gather? What would it be, et cetera? That's a 15-minute conversation, followed by short-term board priorities for about 35 minutes, and then longer-term board priorities for another 35 minutes. I do know that we had invited some members from LUPC, staff members from LUPC to just be on the calls with us from here on out, so we can have a brief conversation about LUPC and irrigation in general towards the end, but obviously that can be an ongoing conversation with them for future meetings too, public comment, and then selecting the next board meeting date. So hopefully board members, in preparing for today's meeting, were able to take a look at this agenda. And turning to number 4, we just wanted to offer up a discussion period of time about, what are the needs that we don't have in our hands right now that can help this board move forward in its work. Back to what we covered in our prior 2 meetings, we talked with NRCS, we talked with the Maine Geological Society folks. We have an understanding of sort of water usage in general throughout the state. Are there other things that we need? George, your hand is raised.
If I may, I'll address number 4. Our recommendation from the potato sector would be that that we support and or request the governor to write a letter to our delegation requesting federal assistance to help with resource development for the period of, say, the next 5 to 10 years with I don't know, I think maybe we do a little bit of an evaluation, but I'll throw out with the state of Maine looking for an additional $10 million. And where I come from with that is I had a meeting with NRCS, and based on historical information since 2016, the federal government has put a significant amount of money in, a little over $11 million, but that has only addressed around 5,400 acres. So that would be my recommendation.
Mm-hmm. Are any reactions or thoughts about that? I definitely think that certainly can be, George. So thank you for that. There's no question in my mind personally that we do need additional outside resources federally, ideally for irrigation assistance, and I think we can definitely add that to the list of priorities and action items for the board. When you mentioned an evaluation, what would you mean by that? Because obviously this board has talked about irrigation generally, but we also need to prioritize, the identification for the ponds and the water impoundments themselves, and let alone the wells and then all the equipment that is related to that.
One mute right now.
So
Maybe if you don't
do we
mind.
need to evaluate where those would be? I guess is my question to you, George.
Well, I guess my thoughts were, when I said evaluation, I guess my thoughts were NRCS probably knows best based on historical information and or their request for funding. If we had a little bit of input in regards to how much funding they think we may also need based on grower requests, because I'm only aware of what's mostly in Aroostook County, and obviously we're not the only county in the state, but we're pretty large. So if we had a state level feedback and or there was also I believe there was a study done a couple of years or a year or so ago in regards to how many irrigators if we had some of that other additional information, I think it would just help support the governor's letter or request. That makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
Brings up the question is we need to do some type of a survey for growers out there, a statewide type of survey to try to get an idea of more of an idea of what the real need is. When you go to a funder, first thing they're going to ask, well, what do you need the money for? And then if you get beyond that, it's going to be, well, how much do you need? And I'm not sure we know exactly what that is. We just heard a good figure probably, but is that enough? Are there other means of getting money besides from the feds as well?
The survey that a few people from UMaine and Caleb from Moffitt did about a year ago didn't address specific amounts of funding needed, but they did ask specific questions about like what were the barriers to drilling additional wells, implementing different practices, and almost universally, the question, I have the financial resources to do this, people said strongly disagree. So that really like seemed like the barrier to every single practice. That's not quantitative, but I think that study can be used to show that that's the main barrier. The other thing is that there's been a lot of surveys this past year for growers. And so we've really been trying to get conscious of survey fatigue. Like every newsletter we put out, there's like 5 new surveys. So I think if we're going to do one, we have to like really have a good reason for it and feel like that's the concrete data that we are going to be able to use.
Well, it seems this is potentially a good reason to me, especially if I was someone who really needed some money to improve my irrigation system or to put one in or develop a water source.
That's a really good point, Rebecca. And I'm, I think that no matter what we do out of this meeting, I think that we could always create a smaller subset of folks who might want to dig into some of the surveys or the drought report or whatnot to kind of pull together the narrative and the information that we have on hand to build that case that George is saying could be outlined in this type of request. And George, to your point about NRCS and their understanding, certainly with the programs that they have a bird's eye view of what the need has been and likely what the need is becoming. I see that Tony is on the line, and I'm going to invite you, Tony, when if you'd like to add any reaction or thoughts to this discussion about, where might NRCS be able to add some insights where its programs could see additional support. I'm assuming maybe the AMA Ag Management Assistance Program, perhaps, or maybe others come to mind with you. Or Matt Walker, I see that you're on the line too.
Yeah, I would defer to Matt. Thank you, Nancy.
Hey, sorry, I'm a little slow in getting my my video and my audio turned on, but we could easily run some reports and let you know how much demand is out there versus how much we're actually able to fund. And then, as George said, it would be good to know where that is around the state, I would think. So, and what types of irrigation and demands there are. So that's something we can put together for sure.
Thank you. All right. Are there any, while we're just still thinking about information gathering and being thoughtful about survey fatigue, et cetera, are there any other queries that you all might have related, unrelated to this idea of a letter, or not? Do we feel like we kind of can use what we might be able to find via our partners at NRCS and through existing reports?
Nancy?
Yeah.
Just a question. I'm assuming that people who are on the Ag Resources Committee at the state level, there may be a lot of new members that, because we weren't, the board hasn't been active. So would be a lot of people on that need to be kind of informed also at the same time, and then maybe some support from that group would help with the request to the feds and vice versa.
I'm sorry, I don't know who that was.
Dave Moyes, I'm sorry. Am I not on? Am I not on?
Yeah, I didn't see you come up video
sorry.
wise, but that's okay. No worries. Thanks for that comment. Okay, well, I don't want to belabor this, but certainly always willing to revisit future needs for irrigation resources. But thank you, Matt and team, for the NRCS input. I think that will be really quite interesting. Moving along then, relative to the short-term board priorities, number 5. Again, these were things that Bill, Mark, and I, and others have helped just put out here. Short-term priorities versus longer-term priorities. Hear what you say, George, relative to funding. There nothing would obviously beat that, but short-term kind of looks a little bit more educational, and happy to kind of walk through your reactions to all of this, folks. If you feel that these would be priorities of this board, and if so, how would you rank them, or what would your requests be, or what do you think might need to be discussed further about them?
I think on your point, Nancy, on education, I think we need to look at possibly educating some farmers in Maine about irrigation. It seems as like when it starts raining, everybody just stops putting in irrigation. But we've found that year over year, sometimes in dry years, 70% of our crop comes from 50% of our land, which is irrigated. And if we want the farms in Maine to be viable, water is one of our greatest resources, and it is abundant in Maine, in most places. So maybe a little bit of education on irrigation would help. So.
I believe that it was raised in the last board meeting that there had been a presentation, I think maybe by someone from New Hampshire NRCS. Perhaps, and I don't know if I'm misremembering or not about that. But we can certainly bring in people and have presentations made. But you all know how you learn or understand or receive information. What are the pluses and minuses of having that type of, or what do you all think would be the most successful way of deploying educational efforts to the end users? It's a crack.
I'm not really sure. In the blueberry industry, we're growing our crop on sand, so we know when it gets dry, we have to irrigate. And there are some people that honestly will never be able to, just because they might be growing on top of a mountain and there's no potential available water resource on their property. But I'm thinking more along the lines of the small farms, not blueberries and maybe not potatoes, but other agricultural producers.
Nancy, I'm wondering, I'll take a stab. I guess I'm not 100% sure what you're looking for here, but from a board's perspective, I think it would be beneficial from the grower side and beneficial for regulators and everyone. For instance, if the department were to typically has annual grants that they produce, the potato industry utilizes cooperative extension significantly for pest updates and weather issues. I'm wondering if it might be beneficial if there was a program available that gave growers statewide a little information where they could access. For instance, there's equipment available at a price. It's not that expensive, but at a price where soil moisture monitors could be implemented. And for instance, I'll use the county for an example where in the Fort Kent region, there might be a weather station that's taking soil moisture data. And maybe there's a couple in central and a couple in southern. And that information was made available to producers on a website. It would help them not only in their record keeping, but it would help them in an assessment standpoint. And maybe you could even incorporate some stream gauge data. I know all on one link versus I myself can go to multiple links and come up with it, but a grower's not going to spend that time. A producer, whether it's a vegetable producer or a potato producer, it's very unlikely. But if there was one website, maybe like the cooperative extension, or maybe, I don't know, maybe an independent would want to apply for a grant and provide that information, make it a link for growers. I don't know, maybe that's something the board would want to support and recommend. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion, George. I'm just thinking back to my wild blueberry days and knowing that, there are weather collection information available to growers as it pertains to weather events and potential for impacts to the crop. And I'm just curious whether or not I'm just recalling that type of information, whether wild blueberries or more generally speaking, those component parts might already exist to some degree at the University of Maine, and it takes a little bit more to bring it all together at Cooperative Extension or not. So I think that could be a to-do for us to talk to Cooperative Extension and others about what data is being collected at UMaine about that. And Bill, where is the information that you're aware of that's collected, or George, for the stream flows and water flows, et cetera? Is that publicly available?
It is. The USGS produces, it's called their water resources page, and it's just a map of the United States. You can click on a map of Maine, see all the gauges. But if you could, the awareness of that and getting real time, because conditions vary geographically and over time, having that available to growers, I think would be really significant to let you know, because part of our regulations are tied to the median flow, and that changes, and it can go, flow can be below the median, and then by the end of the week be above the median, like it did this weekend, and could drop back off. So I think that's a real important tool. I agree with George. Some place to aggregate those kind of conditions geographically would be helpful, I would think. I can send a link in the chat.
I think one of the challenges for cooperative extension in our area is they currently are understaffed. They just don't have, I don't know how it is in the blueberry industry, but we've got them maxed out just doing the few things they're currently doing. So.
Yep, no doubt. And then there's the question of you can provide this data, but will people be able to understand and interpret it appropriately? So there does need to be further explanation of what that all means. But we're probably not the only ones who've ever had this idea, so there might be some models out there to find and take a look at. So that if there's sort of real-time data that is provided somewhere in the state, whether Department of Ag, Cooperative Extension, third party, what have you, that's one thing. Then the education of, through outreach or BMP documentation, et cetera. I think, am I hearing from the board that those are also valuable outlets in the near term to explore further? anyone have any thoughts on, I mean, the 2005 manual that we sent around was, courtesy of the Central Aristic Soil and Water Conservation District. And, it looks like a really good piece of work. So, one option would be to just connect with this conservation district to see if this is still what they use and, push this out a little bit more aggressively. Simple as that. But I'd also defer to folks on this board to look at it through your expert eyes to see, what in 15 years might need to have been updated or changed out. Is that something we would want the Soil and Water Conservation District to do, or could we do it ourselves and give it to them, kind of thing?
I thought that guide was great, and the two things that kind of stuck out to me that might need updating is I wonder if the regulations and permitting process has changed. That's definitely not my area of expertise. And then I think there's been a lot of advances in on-farm water monitoring, like soil moisture monitoring technology. So that would be another good piece update. But maybe just those a few specific pieces of it could be updated.
Great.
Yeah,
Well, go
the
ahead.
regulations definitely need to be updated.
Yeah, it does.
Well, I know that I have Tom Gordon here on the call. He's with the Commissioner's Office and has been working closely for a long time, and now with the Soil and Water Conservation Districts. Maybe Tom, we could connect offline and talk about possible ways of checking in with Central Aristic about this document and seeing we could talk to them about how to bring it up to speed.
Sure. I previously, I think I actually sent it to Bill Sheehan, sent an annotated version that highlights all the areas of regulation that are outdated. So we've at least flagged the sections in that guidebook, and it's mostly one chapter that's seriously out of date, but minor things such as LURC is now LUPC, not minor to them, but something that could be corrected pretty easily. The handbook was done through a grant from the Maine Outdoor Heritage Fund, and very nicely printed. A lot of people had input on it, but I don't think that Central Aristic has, been actively working with that document or is necessarily in the position to immediately update it. But I think, within state government, we'd have capability pretty quickly to identify the regulatory areas that would need to be changed and updated. So that's something that conceivably we could work on. Oh, and I also want to point out, I put in the chat a mention about Sean Burkle and Glenn Kohler. They have a product called Ag Radar Tools, which is very site-specific decision support platform that analyzes detailed weather information for specific growers, and that's something we should probably investigate as well. And one last point is Maine Forest Service has I believe 34 meteorological stations throughout the state. And I believe those stations include calculation of soil moisture information, which they use in their daily fire status reports. I've mentioned it briefly to them, but haven't really pursued that as far as could this be somehow shared with the agricultural community. But just a few points to think about. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. Bill, I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot, given the work that you all went through last year and the presentation you gave at the first meeting, kind of talking about lessons learned from last year. And, you know, what are there things that DEP would like to do if they could, or does DEP have any ideas about ways that it can convey feedback, guidance, information, et cetera, if you had the resources or other, just trying to think about how you all can spread the word.
Yeah, there's certainly several things that we need to do and are working to get the resources to do it. We need to do a better job getting the word out about conditions for people who are using surface water as a source, because as you remember from our demos, the August median flow is the magic number where things start to get very restrictive, and people need to be aware of that. And as I said, it can change geographically and over time. So we're trying to figure out how to help push that along. And, you know, we think of something like the cooperative extension or some sort of tool, and being able to create something that's automated and access via subscription that gets pushed to you. So you haven't got to think about it and actively. It just pops into your email. Hey, the stream that's in your neck of the woods that you might be taking water out of is approaching this median flow number. So be aware of that. Some other things we were struggling with is just getting, there's this alternative flows approval that DEP can issue, and we're really not up to, we haven't ever gotten one, first of all, and second of all, we're not, we're still working out the mechanics of how we would issue those. So that's another thing. And then, you know, as I've said, some BMPs, agreed upon BMPs that we can talk about and point to when there are issues or complaints or something, and just a menu of the little cookbook of, I have this problem, here's 4 or 5 things I can do to mitigate it, and who to talk to, and bringing that up to date. And as Tom pointed out, the main irrigation guide from 2005 had a lot of it. I think we saw some other newer, different things last summer. And so I think all of those could help Maine DEP. And you know, I put our voice behind George's suggestion that, you know, offstream storage is really key to flexibility and resiliency during drought times. And, you know, we don't, Maine DEP, that's how you get rid of Maine DEP in your world, is have off-stream sources that you can go to during these dry periods, whatever they are. And so we absolutely support that. That just, you know, makes a farm resilient when you have that in your back pocket.
So how can this board be helpful to some of those ideas coming to life or getting more support?
Certainly communicating from the board that we need those things. I mean, I think this board's voice is going to be listened to across the board, no pun intended, but you know, if it's coming from me or one person or a few people, but when it's the Ag Water Management Board, and this is what we need for our growers to be able to deal with, you know, these conditions that we're seeing more and more, and be able to you know, have good practices and protect the environment as well.
You know, ideally, I can see this board taking a riff from what George first started offering of a letter by the governor, but also a summary letter or summary position document, nothing big, nothing too onerous to create, that sort of summarizes recommendations generically or generally, excuse me, that we could take to the commissioners of these natural resource agencies, or, you know, to you know, NRCS or other partners, kind of, again, highlighting the opportunities and the needs beyond the funding. But these other projects that added together could really help provide a useful level of information, help with priority setting for staffing or other things internally at departments, et cetera. Mr. Chair, I think we're going to have some subcommittees here, possibly, working on some of these things. So I'm just taking another look at this agenda, still within the short-term priorities. You know, we've talked about BMPs and dusting off that document in some way, shape, or form, making current data information resources more readily available and findable. One thing that's coming into the Department of Ag's world sooner rather than later is a new Healthy Soils program, which was a outgrowth of legislation this most recent legislative session. And really the department is going to be seen as sort of a clearinghouse for information about healthy soil practices, resources, potentially funding, if we were to get funding. But the thinking here, and Mark, you might want to add to this, Mark Hedrick, and Tom as well, you know, if we are able to be successful generally, not just our department, obviously it's so many players, in advancing healthy soil practices, greater water retention, moisture retention, excuse me, in the soils. Not to say that doesn't, you know, stop the need for irrigation, but perhaps it, you know, your soil and your farms are in a better shape to begin with. Is that resonating with the board at all to move forward, you know, positively or in support of Healthy Soils program and kind of weaving in an irrigation overlay to that?
I think that the health soils thing is a good idea. Personally, myself, from the vegetable standpoint of it, there may be some industries where it'd be a little bit tougher to do, but I personally think the healthy soils thing is a good idea to do, and it does go along. If you can retain the water, it's as good as putting it on. It's better than putting it on. I don't know if you can get there that quick though. Building up soil organic matter is a tough thing to do. I've been working on it for a while, but I still think it's a great idea, especially on sandy soils like we have.
Thanks, Rick. Hi, Abby.
Hi, I just want to agree with Rick that I think for a lot of folks, you know, in some cases for veg producers, it's going to be stacking those two functions, improving soils and improving irrigation. For other folks who don't have the option of irrigation, as was mentioned earlier, I would also think of a lot of livestock producers where we're probably not going to have the money to irrigate hay, but we really do need to keep making hay at quantity. That having access to an additional pool of funding or having the state prioritize that so that funding for improving soil organic matter would be super helpful.
Thanks. Any other reaction?
would just echo what Abby just said about funding for that, because in that survey, the drought survey last year, like fully, I think it was like, it looks like it, majority of people felt like they had enough information on how to do soil health changes. It was that they didn't have the financial thing. So I think that there's been a lot of good work between NRCS and everywhere promoting soil health, and NRCS does have some funding, but I think more funding sources and maybe ones that are faster to access potentially.
Yep, good point. Well, the Bureau will certainly be keeping this in mind as we move forward with constructing this new Healthy Soils program by statute, and we would have done it anyway. We will be consulting with partners like Cooperative Extension, NRCS, Soil and Water Conservation Districts. This board's input will be important. So we will keep it close in mind about the irrigation overlay and the resources and the funding. So we'll make sure to note that in our summary for this board. Did anyone have any other reactions or thoughts about the short-term board priorities in section 5? Have we forgotten anything? Anything else anyone wants to add?
I guess I just want one other thing. You know, we had our first 2 meetings identifying problems, and we saw some videos of some irrigation practices that weren't the greatest. And I was wondering if there could be some education for potential irrigators or people that want to expand. You know, do they even realize there is a chapter 587 low flow rule? And, you know, a lot of them are going to say, well, what is a 7Q10, blah, blah, blah. You know, it's just over their head. And I think, you know, some of the education on the low flow rule has to be implemented.
I definitely hear that and would offer that if we can provide the venues to reach the biggest audience. I'll be there and I'll drag some of my cohorts along. And I think Cooperative Extension and Department of Ag could help as well. But, you know, I'm happy to talk about the regulations such as they are and explain, you know, the 4 or 5 key things that are confusing. And you're right on, Darren, that lots of my conversations start with, you ever heard of chapter 587? get a blank look, and then we go from there. So, you know, we need to get the word out. And I'd take any opportunity that came up to do that.
One idea comes to mind, which is, you know, reaching out, connecting you, Bill, with maybe Farm Bureau or, you know, MOFGA or others, just to see if there are dates and times or ways to provide that type of information, whether in person or through just materials. You know, I would be interested in what George might think would be beneficial for potato growers, or Eric and Darren relative to wild blueberries, you know, and the folks, the nurseries, livestock producers, you know, what do you find to be the best ways of receiving information amidst your busy schedules?
I know from the vegetable standpoint, we have the vegetable growers has got a newsletter that they put out quarterly as well, and that could be easily added on to that newsletter. And I know the bulk of the vegetable growers, they really they take advantage of the agricultural trade show in January. I know that's a ways away, but that's when they're thinking about educational things.
We, in the potato, for instance, the potato board puts out a monthly newsletter through an email. If Bill wanted to insert something, we'd be more than happy to post that. And also from from a school side perspective, typically prior to COVID, we used to have an annual potato school where growers came for a 2-day event and sat and got pesticide credits, sat through different presentations. I think something could be developed there, but also think it would be I think it would be beneficial if there was somebody from the department instead of, I know Bill is real short staffed as well. I don't know if the department has staff or not, but I know we utilize the department for different things. When I say we, the potato industry, it might be beneficial if there was an individual that was brought up to speed in regards to low flow information, but also what a grower's perspective and daily operation is like, and if that individual was available to go around, and maybe if Bill got a complaint, instead of Bill having to go pound on somebody, maybe they could send somebody out and have them sit down with the grower. It's just food for thought. Darren, do you have you probably don't run into a lot of withdrawal issues from, or do you on the blueberry sector? You may the more you develop irrigation, but what's your thought?
A number of years ago, during the first Ag Water Management Board, we were irrigating out of surface waters and a few rivers. But for the most part, the blueberry industry has gotten out of a lot of natural surface water. We do utilize impoundments, and we're lucky that we can put in significant groundwater wells here, which we've done, quite well. We're still increasing our irrigation footprint every year, but I don't think that the blueberry industry as a whole is withdrawing from natural surface waters or lakes and streams and violating Chapter 587. I think for the most part, we're pretty good.
Okay. I also think it would be beneficial. For instance, there are, if you're a producer, you go to NRCS, typically you have to have an irrigation water management plan written first. And I write a lot of those, but I think something that would be very beneficial for a producer and for everybody is if there was a small grant available for research development, whether it was a groundwater well or a set aside pond or what have you. A lot of this funding sometimes gets approved and the grower or the producer doesn't really have enough information, in my opinion, to sit down and say, I'm going to spend $30,000 or $150,000 of my own money. And if there was for instance, we used to do, the Department of Ag used to have $80,000 grants for resource development. But my thoughts are, even if we had a $20,000 or $30,000 grant and or program available, so that investigation could be done, so that if dollars are spent, they're spent wisely. Sometimes we don't need to be building a 4-acre reservoirs when we could get by maybe with an acre and a half, and we incorporated a well in it. And NRCS is really reluctant to spend big dollars for groundwater wells, and because if it doesn't yield, they're not going to pay for it. But if we had a program available, it might help us spend our money more wisely. Just another thought.
I agree.
If I could jump in real quick, Nancy and Chair Hammond. George, I agree also. You brought that idea up in a previous group, and I think it's a great idea. And along the same lines, I think that when you're talking about Asking our congressional delegation to seek more funds for NRCS irrigation support. That sounds great. And I think we also need to make sure, like the idea you just mentioned, George, that we are trying to source funds that help us to address the risk that you just mentioned and the barriers to NRCS funding that currently exists. We can't just increase NRCS funding. We also have to supplement that funding to fill in the gaps if we want to extend the availability of funding and increase irrigation more generally. And I'd say that would also go for the layered approach you mentioned, Nancy, not just irrigation, but mulch, et cetera.
Great. Dave, you have your hands up.
Yes, I did. I was just curious if there's some opportunity to work with the University of Maine. Certainly master's and doctorate programs are always looking for things to research, if you will. That would be helpful. Something really hands-on, I guess, to kind of piggyback what George was just saying. Is there opportunity there to be doing some research at a smaller scale? I'm sure Rick and Abby could chime in on that, but sort of looking at bigger farms and smaller farms and see what is it, how much is enough, what size do they need to be. I mean, it seems like there's a lot of opportunity there, but maybe with the civil engineering department also, obviously hydraulics will be involved. But to partner with the University of Maine, NRCS, federal funding, so on, they can kind of maybe help with some focus of research at the University of Maine. I know it's a little more long term, but I mean, a year or two goes very quickly. So I just thought I'd mention that. Also wondering on the association, like Rick was talking about, for the small growers, are there particular associations in the state? Obviously, he mentioned a couple, but would have newsletters, and that seems like a really good place to go to get the word out. Have them, they can kind of help us. I don't know if there's someone that can come up with a list of that. I don't travel in that circle, so I don't know if that's a list. And one other quick question to Rick or Abby or someone: do small growers tend to see irrigation as something that's only used by big growers? I mean, are they scared of it? I guess, for the lack of better wording. So they just tend to not be interested. They think it's going to be this long, arduous, very costly, maybe type process.
I would say yes to that. Some of the smaller growers will just use the resources that they have, which are very limited, like a small well and trickle irrigation. But most of them are probably afraid of looking more into it, would be my thought.
So perhaps,
I think.
Go ahead, I'm sorry. I was going to say perhaps some short list of, without having to provide them with a big guide they have to read through or some big document or whatever, we could come up with something that would be very brief but to the point that we could share with them, so they could say, well, geez, maybe that would work for me, or no, it won't. But without a lot of time and effort, I know they're all busy. So
Right. I think going back to that point too, that a lot of growers don't have access to other surface water, so they're looking at groundwater, and NRCS is really one of the few places you can get help for a well, but it does need to yield a certain amount. I think that's a barrier to some small veg growers. And then I think, maybe as a livestock producer, I'm just like not imaginative enough, but the idea of putting in a well to irrigate hay still seems really far-fetched in terms of economics. So I think a guide that could help people overcome what they think is possible would be really beneficial.
Hey, Dave, I can answer your question, as far as research. The blueberry industry, it's probably been 12 years ago or more now. They worked with the university and some other entities, and they did a 6-year irrigation study. So You know, we do have the data now to know exactly what a wild blueberry needs in both the cropping and the non-cropping cycle. So that information for us was incredibly beneficial.
I'm trying to remember, and someone probably knows this on the call, was Cooperative Extension able to hire the ag engineer position? No, Rebecca, no. Has it been delayed? Maybe sometime in the future?
I know that they were talking about it from Monmouth. They were trying to find an ag engineer that would do like 2 jobs at once, but I haven't heard anything whether they got that position opened up or not. I mean, whether they filled it.
Rebecca, I think you were muted when you were trying to say something a moment ago.
Oh, yeah, they haven't filled it yet, and I don't know the most current status, but I could ask about that.
Yeah, I'm not sure when the next Board of Ag meeting is, but certainly that's something.
It's been,
Eric? Yeah,
I think I can share that it's been delayed.
okay. Okay. Yeah. As I recall too, in one of the earlier conversations of this board and pursuant to some of the questions I think that Abby had raised about some of the ways in which to retain water or capture water for livestock and NRCS maybe having some lessons learned from out west. Maybe that's something we could also put on the list to, and Abby, if I'm completely mangling this, please correct me. But it seems to me that would be something we've got to revisit.
Yes, I think that's accurate. You got it.
Okay. All right. So why don't we segue? I think if we move to the longer term board priorities at this point in time, you know, I feel like we've already started talking about this clearly. So we don't need to necessarily use all this time on it, but to the point which I feel that the board is quite open to of crafting a letter requesting additional federal support. You know, would that letter kind of be speaking to some of these things that are listed here, or do we need to bore down into these areas of particular projects and project areas more as we consider this request? You know, we don't want to just ask for money. We need to be talking about how it would be used and why that's important. So just really want to open up folks' reaction to the longer term board priorities and how they could relate to this letter or be standalone issues.
Nancy, what if the board reached out to the different sectors of agriculture, the potato sector, the blueberry sectors, the MOFGA, small fruits, vegetables, whatever. What if we reached out to each entity and asked for a letter of recommendation or support, and then the board could push that or add that with a letter of recommendation to the governor? Wouldn't that be a decent avenue to show that what the request would be or look like and what the resources would be used for?
I think that's a creative way of getting that from the horse's mouth.
Well, that way you're not just taking everything that George says and not taking everything that Darren says or everything that Bill says. And we can move it forward instead of just, because we sat and listened to everybody's concerns the first 2 meetings. I think it was pretty evident and clear that what the issues were and why the board was being reenacted, and let's do something.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I think we could all agree that the adequacy of existing funding is inadequate. If it wasn't, everybody would be irrigating on every acre that's possibly being able to be irrigated in the state of Maine, and that's just not happening today. And I think, before we make an ask, we really should know what we're asking for or how much. Or maybe we should make an ask for multiple years. There's only so much you can do in a year.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And I think that just this list that we're fleshing out right now of short-term and longer term is a lot of work, and a lot of good stuff that it's going to take coordination and cooperation and planning to get off the ground over time. And circling back to what Matt Walker volunteered at the beginning of this conversation today about kind of pulling some information and some reports to understand what the level of need is, that I think will be incredibly impactful for the ultimate ask. To George's idea of having some of the groups themselves then speak to what they see on the ground as the need or where the funding sources would go relative to that crop or crops or production practice, I think adds weight. And especially if some of the folks speaking are also members of this board. So I think that would be helpful. And I also really, just to comment on the point about, technical grants or research grants to investigate the adequacy of systems that people are proposing. I think that's a really great idea. Filling the gap. It can't all just be NRCS. What could the state do? In the last couple of years, and since I've come on board, we have the Ag Development Grant, which is not necessarily well suited for irrigation. But we do have a rarely used technical grant that is small dollars. It's not enough, but perhaps that could be a request to the legislature. I believe we would have to have legislative support to change the amount of money that we could utilize for state funding for that, for technical assistance programs. But anyway, I'll certainly give it a thought with my team as to rethinking what we currently have, or are there some brand new asks that we would need to make? Rebecca, you have your hand up.
So just to clarify, would this request for federal funding be entirely going to existing programs like NRCS, or would we be specifically saying like we want some of it to distribute through the state, through other programs, or could any of it be used for research or providing more technical support?
Great question. I think it could probably be anything we wanted to ask for, but I would err on certainly wanting to utilize currently existing programs that we know are working well, but would benefit from additional cash infusions to make them more robust rather than making something new out of full cloth. George, did you have any thoughts on that? Or Rick, your hand is up as well.
I had a question. Does anybody? I have no idea what it costs to do what we're talking about. A source, investigate the sources of the for water sources. What does it cost to have somebody do that? To look for groundwater or any ideas? I have no idea myself.
I don't know if Darren can share with, I know in our area, it used to run for a hydrogeologist to do a study and whatnot, you could spend 35,000. I don't know what the current rates are, and it also is dependent on the site. So
yeah,
what the needs are.
Thank you.
In my area, it really depends on how much 2.5-inch pipe they're going to drive in the ground. You usually pay by the foot. And they're basically looking, in our area, they're looking for coarse sand and gravel deposits. So just something that the water can run through really fast instead of fine sand. So, in the fall, you could, in our area, if you wanted to keep looking, you could spend $100,000 just looking, or if you get lucky and you do a little bit of research yourself and look at some of the geology, you might potentially find a well on the first one. So it really is a shot in the dark. And in our area, once you find a potential well, we always have to put in an 8-inch well just as a test well, just to make sure that the aquifer will handle it. So in the past, I have applied for a resource development grant through the Department of Ag and was awarded one. But we were awarded $80,000 resource development grant, and that was probably a third of the cost of the project.
When was that, Darren?
I'd have to look in the file. It was at least 12, 14 years ago.
Okay,
I'll have that information for you on Wednesday.
thanks. I see a hand raised from Maine Potato Board. Go ahead.
Thanks, Nancy. It's Don Flannery. I don't know how to change my name or do anything, so you got my logo. I get on late, so I didn't hear what Matt had to say, and I think I just listened to George talk about reaching out to other groups. You and I have chatted, and I know I've chatted with Bill and Matt and others. I think there's a lot of opportunity here for this board to make funding a priority, and there are many different things that relate to importance as it relates to requesting this funding. But I think that, George's idea of reaching out to those individual groups, we can give you from the potato side a list of, priorities for us. I'm sure Darren can from blueberries, Rick can, and somebody from small fruit and vegetables, and include that in there, because I think this needs to be as broad as it is long. The first step is saying the state is making this a priority. We need to secure resources, financial resources, to ensure that we can provide irrigation in Maine as needed, where needed, for sustain, to ensure that we have a sound food supply, address climate change, and that's the step one. I think the other steps, and like I said, list those things in there that may need, but I think it'd be as broad as it is long, because once it moves forward, if the state makes a priority and that goes out to USDA, whether it's NRCS or wherever it may be, and the delegation gets involved, there's going to be other questions they're going to be asked, and that's when it's going to be fine-tuned. So I would encourage this board not to get tangled up in the weeds to try to include everything from soup to nuts in the letter, but to give a broad perspective of what's needed, and then worry about fine-tuning it at a later point. Because if you try to get everything from soup to nuts in the letter, you're going to be forever getting it done. So, like I said, I appreciate the opportunity to say something. I know I'm not on the committee, but that's my thoughts anyway. Thank you.
Yep. I am certainly in agreement that those types of letters don't have to be overly detailed, for sure. And I do think some of the information gathering that we've identified as needed to help amplify this letter and make it effective is not going to be necessarily a big lift, but one that I think will just make it more precise. And I do think, as we wrap up today's meeting over the next 45 minutes or so, we can talk about next steps, try and put together some internal dates that we'd like to meet, ask for some volunteers to help collect and review some of this information to keep the ball rolling. I do know that many of you are already quite busy, but will only continue to get busier as the summer progresses. But not something that we want to put on the back burner either, and waste valuable time too. Were there any other thoughts about the long-term listing of ideas on the agenda? any and all thoughts on state funding sources. And this was certainly before my time and the current administration's time of I believe the bond that might have been successful a decade or so ago. Is that something anyone wants to flag for us as a successful model, maybe wanting to bring back again? Or revisiting at least? We'll wait on that for a sec, but Abby, I see your hands are up.
Yeah, I just wanted to put in a plug for having the word innovation or some sort of regional sharing mechanism. I was curious, like, if this becomes a state priority, what other states have this prioritized? And I think I remember walking away from the last meeting really feeling comfortable that NRCS understood that what we might not even be thinking of in Maine in terms of water conservation, we should be thinking about already, based on experiences out west. And so I think how do we anticipate, what might seem more far-fetched or radical now? And are there opportunities for our state to learn from other states where they've already had to come to grips with changes in water resource availability seasonally or just overall?
How would you recommend, and maybe I'll look to you, Rebecca, given perhaps your expertise with research and evaluation, like how might we be able to find out whether those other resources are out there? Just so that we're casting a wide net and gathering that information appropriately. Or Abby, you might have come across some things and we can be inspired by those.
I mean, I think that NRCS is really well positioned to do that work. I just wonder if it's a need to say, like, okay, NRCS understands that nationally there's a need to share what works out west with what may not, what we might need to be thinking about back east, and do those conversations come up at the state level as well? Like, when all the governors get together, can that be a priority if the state identifies it as a priority? Does that make more sense? So instead of those silos sort of talking to each other, how can those conversations overlap so that innovation can happen? And again, so that, it's not on the back of Maine farmers to go out and research how to set up irrigation that is going to work when we only get, so many inches of rain per year versus what we get now. Does that make sense?
Yep, it does. Thank you. Speaking as a state that belongs to the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture, drought is very much top of mind for many, many states, if not all the states. So it is something that we can advance and raise both regionally and nationally in our various communications going forward, Abby. So we'll be sure to see what folks are doing and gather information that way. And likewise, work with and ask our partners at NRCS to be thinking about that information gathering and information sharing on an ongoing basis. I don't want to move away from the bond just yet. Is that what it was a while ago? Yeah, Mark, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I think there were 4 bonds. It was, I think, $500.5 million right around that area. It's quite a few years ago now, and that seemed to work well. I think it's discussed in the water management manual, the 2005 manual. There's a section in about it.
I believe
Hi,
it was
Tom.
2008.
Oh. Go ahead, Darren.
I believe it was around 2008, and then maybe another one around 2011.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, first first one I think was 2004. There were
Yeah.
4 successive bonds that did very well. And then we had a change in administration and there was no further action on irrigation. Plus, you know, our early 2000s drought situation had pretty much ended. We have quite a bit of data in our files. Mark, I'm sure, has a lot of it on all of the irrigation projects that were funded. We've got that in our common drive.
Yes.
And so this was a bond that funded a grant that was done by our Department of Agriculture and allowed for equipment as well as you tell me.
Plans and equipment, and I believe the formal approval of those grants was done through the Ag Water Management Board. The department did the administrative processing, you know, made its recommendations, and the board made the formal approval, and then back to the department for contracting.
Yes.
Yeah, that would be your job, Nancy.
I'll add it to the list.
She'd probably delegate it.
He's a clone.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm certainly conscientious, and I'm sure you all would want there to be, if funding becomes available, you know, we want it to go through existing channels, or if we need to create new channels, we don't overprocess them and make them so problematic that it's hard to access. So, Dawn, I see your hand is raised.
Thanks, Nancy. Yes, everybody's right. That was a very successful program. The funds were put out. And that's a discussion that needs to happen, because that might be the trigger that helps you get the federal funding and uses match money to really make this thing work. I think it's a great thing to think about and keep in your back pocket to use. Obviously, it's not going to be for a while before we can do it, but that very well may be the trigger that helps the federal money flow. I think that happened with, and I've said this before, when the state made nutrient management a priority, and NRCS dedicated a lot of money to manure pits, and the state also had money that went into that, and that was kind of the leverage to make that all happen. So this very similar to me. This, in my mind, this can work very similar to that. So. I think that's a good discussion to have, and it may be the catalyst to make the federal money happen even a little easier.
Yeah, that's right. It was $5.5 million back then when the nutrient management program started back around 1997, 98. And that's also when the nutrient management loan program began as well, to help fund some of the projects.
Okay. So we can put some thoughts around that, go back and look at the vault, so to speak, what's in there for information about how it was set up, et cetera. And obviously, I don't think a $5 million bond is going to cover it right now. What is 2021, $22 looking like today for a large number of folks? So I think we would want to have access to it. So what's a reasonable amount to be putting forward? But food for thought there. Okay. Any other thoughts on any of these lists? One of the things that we just listed under 6 was development of water management plans. Mark, I'm going to ask you to speak to that. Was that something that the prior board iteration also did or prioritized, or Darren or Tom?
Yeah, that's correct. There's an example and a template, I guess you could call it, in that water management guide as well, where each farm had to know whether, what they needed for water, what the crop was, what the source was going to be, that type of thing. So yeah, and I think George, you're developing a lot of those plans now, I believe. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct, Mark. Mostly, but for the most part, I help facilitate it for potato producers. Not everybody will come to the potato board, but NRCS will also do some. But yeah, just to try to, I got involved in it back in 2008 when I first came here. I had a couple growers that wanted to reach out for that, the state grant, and because they weren't having success at the federal level. And so anyway, I helped write their water management plans and help them apply for their grants. That's why I'm aware of what it was back then. So yeah.
So what would be the board's druthers now for water management plans to be part and parcel with grants or all of that? How do we feel about that?
Well, it would seem to me you need to have a good plan available to be eligible to get that money, because you can't just throw that money out there without someone having a real need for it and knowing how exactly it's going to be used. Seems to me that
there's already, or there was, back when I used to fill out the grant application, there's a template already. I've probably still got it. I don't seem to throw anything away, but there's a template of what's required per applicant, and you have to include, there's a fair amount of information to even apply for it. And I can't imagine it would take that much to critique it to the current requirements. In the event we decided that we can find some money for people to apply for, I think it comes down to we need to make a priority and see if we can find the resources, and then I think we can put the other information together with it quickly. But
And just because I don't know the answer to this, what would it take for someone to pull together a water management plan as part of that process? How much help do they need even before coming forward with an application?
well, for somebody who's used to doing it, it probably, I would say of course, every plan's a little bit different, and I can't speak for blueberries. I've put together a template for broccoli, but for the most part, you're looking at, I think 40 hours is more than adequate. You might even, once you got up to speed, depending on the size of the project, you could probably produce one in 24 hours. Like I said, it depends on how much the size of it and how much information you're trying to incorporate in it, because it's a, for instance, it will an initial irrigation water management plan will make recommendations for the source, but without doing the preliminary investigation, then you won't find all the fine, without doing test pits, for instance, or drilling monitoring wells, you won't find the information. That's where I had mentioned that, a research development grant, because irrigation water management plan just pretty much dictates what the grower wants to do, how much water is needed, what the intent is, and what are some potential options.
Okay. Thank you for that.
That helps clarify.
All right. Dave, did you want to add anything? Dave Weiss?
Yes, I'm just curious. I'm sure Don has spoken to Senator Collins a couple times over the years, but do we have any, either one of our senators or either one of our U.S. representatives that does anyone have their ear that certainly those are resources there and they have staff, give us a hand, if you will, particularly gathering nationwide type information. They may be able to get it more quickly than perhaps some of us, but also someone to help spearhead, potential funding sources, once we kind of have it together, so to speak. So.
Well, I think the all of the delegation members have agricultural staff that we from the department speak to on a fairly regular basis on a host of different topics. And likewise, I'm sure members of these ag groups have relationships with staff as well. And I do think, Dave, to your point, making a concerted ask by this board for funding and support in these various areas that we're talking about can't just rest in a letter. It will require follow-up and further dialogue. So I'm sure that through the channels that we all have, that message can be delivered and emphasized going forward when we're ready to move and debut the ask. All right, well, I'm just looking at the time and I feel like we've been having a robust discussion, and Mark's hand is probably going to fall off soon with all the note taking here. But there, I think the notes from today's discussion are going to be very helpful about kind of next steps and who's on first and gathering kind of the plan of action to go forward. But I just want to invite members of the public who are listening at this point in time. Mr. Chair, are you okay with that if we go to that now?
That would be great.
We've already allowed a few folks to speak, but if anyone else is listening in and has any ideas, suggestions, questions, feel free to pipe up. And if not, let's see. You didn't want to skip over LUPC. Oh, Tony, did you have your hand up?
I didn't want to take meeting time too much, Nancy, just as certainly George and Don know, and Mark, and some others, but the financial assistance that NRCS can administer has to go through certain hoops. And so if if you want more specificity on that, I think Matt reported on that in the past, but we'd be glad to provide that information. And there are a lot of dynamics, but I guess your first thing would be to get more funding if that's what you want. And we certainly would do our very best within the law to to administer that.
Thanks, Tony. Well, I'll touch briefly. I don't know if folks from LUPC joined us today. We did invite them along as part of.
I am here, Nancy.
Hi,
just to let you know.
Hi. Sorry, I didn't see you. Thanks for joining us today. And as you can see, we have some wide-ranging conversations about irrigation. So thank you for joining us. I was just going to very briefly mention that we had spoken with you and your team as follow-up to our second meeting in April, talking about how, LUPC is different, has a different purview, has zoning responsibilities within its scope that make it a different process than DEP when it comes to some of the activities that we've been talking about, such as wells and being permitted for that. I thought we had a robust discussion about kind of why those are existing differences, et cetera. I didn't necessarily think that, we left that conversation with changes, to come, but more so a better understanding of LUPC's process and wanting to be more in contact with you all as we discuss what is a statewide concern of, finding and funding sustainable water resources for agricultural production in the state. So I really just put this on the agenda today to let board members know that we had that conversation with LUPC, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but if you wanted to add any words about how you guys are viewing irrigation or projects or just anything that comes to mind, feel free, or if you just want to take a rain check and be a part of our conversations going forward, that's certainly fine too.
Oh, I'll just say that we're happy to have that conversation with you, and thank you for including us in the discussion. It was great to listen in today. So hopefully
And I
we'll be
would-
here in case any other questions come up.
Yeah, and it, we've spoken a lot about DEP and DACF today, but anytime you feel that LUPC would want to weigh in or add its name to the list as part of the department relative to supporting funding or resource management or development, just certainly let us know about that too. Demonstrates that we're all talking to each other and keeping each other in the loop. Anyone want to add to that conversation, Mark or Darren or Bill? Having had that, no? Okay. Sounds great. Well, before we talk about the next meeting date, I think it might be useful, Mark, can I ask you to kind of glance through your notes real quickly and summarize some of the real action items that you've been noting? I know obviously there's our broader question letter development for a federal ask. And maybe we can focus on what we think might be some immediate next steps that you've jotted down, hearing from NRCS on a couple of things, looking at the drought survey. Can we figure out what we might want to do around this letter and see if there's any interim next steps that we want to put on the to-do list for a few of us?
Sure. I have to translate my scribbles first. That's the only thing, the most difficult thing usually. But yeah, it looks like there's interest in that letter, but to be a little more clear on who we want to use it for and what we need it for and how much money we really need for it, whether we want to do the management plans, which seem to be of interest, trying to get more information out there on BMPs through various newsletters of various organizations, whether it be Potato Board or MOFCA or some Maine Vegetable Growers Association, Blueberry Association. That seemed to be of interest. Interest in developing monitoring of the need out there. There are various entities that record what the water levels are in the streams and rivers. There are devices now for measuring soil moisture that can be utilized. Some are fairly easy to use, some are not so easy to use, so that we're not adding more water than we really need at times. Utilizing perhaps the department's Healthy Soils program for incorporating some of this information. Let's see. Bringing together cooperative extension, NRCS, for gaining some of this educational information, putting that together. Matt Walker is going to summarize data that they have for previous requests that are ongoing for funding, requests that aren't getting funded for lack of money. Part of that would be good information, really good information to have. I mean, I brought up that survey thing, which kind of fell flat, and I understand why. But again, I think it's clear that knowing what the real need is for when we go to our funders and how much we really need is, I still say that's a critical element of this entire thing. We talked about updating that irrigation guide, and I went through that entire thing, and I think it would be a useful thing for growers to have. Some of it would be fairly easy to update, some of it maybe not so easy. Most of the stuff that's out of date is some of the regulations are out of date. A lot of the people and names are certainly out of date, but there's still a lot of information in there that's doesn't need to be, it really doesn't need to be changed. It seems to me that's a pretty good guide. Find someone with the expertise, not only the expertise, but necessarily the time to, and the funding to do it. Probably take some bucks to put that together. And as someone, I guess Tom mentioned, I don't know that Central Roofing really has the resources for doing that, doing all that work at this point. They probably have the document that we could build on for doing it with. That certainly would be helpful.
Okay.
So, I don't know.
Well,
There are other things that are not coming back exactly at the moment.
yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you for just the high level, high points. I know there's some of the information gathering as well from current and existing resources, NRCS, about sort of what's happening nationwide, and I'll certainly see what's happening through my end when meeting with national colleagues as well. Darren, what do you think makes the most sense in terms of next steps with this? We obviously will create meeting minutes. Would we want to wait for that to then ask board members? Because I feel like there's so many moving parts for all of us. We don't need to have another board meeting to walk through this. We need to dedicate a couple of volunteers here and there to collect data, push things forward, draft a letter, that kind of thing on these subject areas. So it's sort of like the federal letter, I think, is one. The BMPs is another one. I'll volunteer Department of Ag staff to look at the state grant and bond area and bring that back up to date. We might want to add, as part of the BMPs, the data monitoring resources everybody threw in the chat box, because those could probably get put into an updated BMP. I think those might be the buckets that I'd be interested in, if you think it's a good idea, Darren, to see if there might be some folks willing to do some, subcommittee work, which I don't want to be time consuming, and we can do a lot of this by email. Do you think that might make sense?
I think that makes the most sense.
Then maybe-
Especially given that where we are in the year, everybody's really busy.
Yep. Would folks want to raise their hand as to if they were capable and interested, what bucket they'd like to be, helpful on, or do you want me to just send an email out after and collect that information later? I'm happy to do either.
I think we need to get some kind of a flow chart that goes from the board. I wrote down, we have the board, and then we have, determine needs, how much, and then ask whether it's from the feds or a bond. And then my other bucket was education and, education on chapter 587, BMP,
Yep.
soil health, water retention, blah, blah, blah. I think we just need to organize it into buckets, just so we can wrap our head around, because we're going in multiple directions all at the same time.
Fair point. Okay.
Yeah.
So why don't you, Mark, and I work through the minutes and sort of create these buckets, org chart, whatever you want to call it, and we will correspond with the board thereafter, and over email create some action items and get some volunteers involved. Would it make sense, Darren, to tentatively have the next board meeting sometime this fall, where people could report back on progress on these buckets, or do we want to do a doodle poll in a couple of months and deal with it then?
Maybe late this fall.
Fine by me. What do the board members feel? We don't want to gather prematurely, but we don't want to press snooze too many times. You're muted.
In the interim, we can work on getting this organized, and then send out an email.
I'd agree.
Okay. All right. That sounds good. Well, I feel as though we're synthesizing things and honing in on a few things. So give us a couple weeks to get these minutes and our act together. And maybe get through wild blueberries. Not sure. And we'll circle back with you all and create some action plans and action items from there. Any final comments from the chair or members? No? Okay. Well, thanks, everybody. It's nice to see you all. Hope you continue to do well, and we will be in touch soon.
Thank you.
Oh, meeting adjourned, I guess. Chair, will we? Sorry,
May I have a motion?
I'll make a motion, the meeting adjourn.
I second the motion.
Thank you, Darren.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Great. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.